Good morning. Chapter 14. Emily's arms were tired. She turned onto her back and sculled with her hands down by her side. The swells were smaller now. The moon had a fuzzy aura around it, and if she were looking at it through smeared glass, it was not quite full, and so it had an imperfect oblong shape. It seemed to stare down at her like a head, cocked slightly to the side. She gazed at the sky. There were fewer stars now, too. It must be getting cloudy, she said. It was too dark to see the clouds until they were close to the moon. Then they would pass quickly in front of it and blink her into darkness for a moment. Well, I hope there aren't too many, she said to the sky. I don't think I could live without you, Moon. It feels good to have you looking down on me. I know you're looking down on my parents right now, too. Maybe they're looking up at you, and it's kind of a link between us. For some silly reason, she suddenly had a picture of Luke Skywalker calling telepathically to Princess Leia while he was hanging from a chute at the bottom of the City of the Clouds. She squinted her eyes at the moon, and in her head she said, Olivia, James, I'm here. She sighed. If only she had that kind of magic. She straightened up to check the speck of light on the horizon. She didn't want to get off track. Then she lay back and sculled some more, looking at the sky. Now, a real cloud, a thick one, was passing slowly in front of the moon. She held her breath as the sky grew dark. It happened gradually, as if the moon were on a dimmer switch. The blue glow around her became smaller and smaller until she was floating in the center of a weak spot of blue light, and then finally in full blackness. She straightened up again and treaded water. It was dark without that moon, very dark. She let out her air and drew a little gasp more. How long would it take for the cloud to pass? She peered out into the darkness. She swallowed. She took another little gasp of air. This is stupid, she squeaked. She cleared her throat. You're not really afraid of the dark, are you? She said in a bigger, deeper voice. She began swimming the breaststroke again. In the dark, she was alone. She couldn't even see her own hands trembling in front of her. She did not like having her body, or she didn't like not having her body as company. She needed to see her arms reaching in front of her. Those arms proved with each stroke that she was here, alive. I still have my voice, she said defiantly, and the sound of the water, she thought. She strained to hear the waves, and she heard something in the distance. Was it a motor? She held her breath and stopped swimming, staying as silent as possible. Her heart was beating hard. It could be rescue boats. It could be a commercial ship. It could be another ferry. She listened, and sometimes she thought she heard a hum, but it would fade into nothing, and she would be left with the sound of the water licking against her body and the sound of her breath short and shallow. Was that something she saw out of the corner of her eye? She spun around. Nothing. I'm hallucinating, she concluded. I'm so desperate for those boats, I'm making them up in my mind. This is just like seeing a mirage in the desert. She found the light on the horizon and started her breaststroke again. The blue glow of the moon began to reappear around her, steady as a nightlight in a child's bedroom. To her relief, she caught sight of her hands again, and her arms, keeping her company, spreading in front of her in a steady rhythm. She looked at her bracelet. She'd forgotten about that. Well, I guess I just don't have leggings and a watch, she said. I have a bracelet, too. Her father had brought it from Kota Gadang. He had gone to the village to vaccinate children, and he always brought something back to her. Usually it was something little, something locally made and fun. This time it was even more special, more beautiful. It was silver, made of delicate spiderweb strands that were twisted around each other at irregular intervals. There were purple amethyst beads anchored in the strands. To Emily, they looked randomly placed as if the spider had left the carcasses of its last meals dotted along the bracelet. It was beautiful, and it was digging into her arm. The motion of swimming against the swells and the waves repeatedly pressed the sharp clasp against her wrist, and for the first time that night, she realized it was cutting her. She tried to change its position on her wrist. She turned it so the clasp faced up. She pushed it lower toward her hand to loosen it and get it off her arm. It rode back to the same spot and gouged at the tiny wound with each stroke. There was nothing worse than a small, neglected cut in the tropical heat of Indonesia, Emily knew. The temperature and humidity were just right to breed bacteria. Ordinary splinters, blisters, or even scratched mosquito bites could become quickly infected. She had gotten used to tending to wounds right away, keeping them as clean and as dry as possible, and applying antibiotic ointment to everything. And what happened if you soaked a wound for hours in the salt water of the ocean? She wondered. I have to get rid of this bracelet, she said out loud. I can't get rid of it. James gave it to me, she answered herself. You don't need it. It's not helping you. Why don't you just let it go? Well, she shot back, you really like the bracelet. That's something you want to keep. You really plan on living, don't you? She said. Yes, she did, she decided. And she could live without the bracelet. She stopped swimming and treaded water. I'll make James buy me a new one, she said finally, opening the clasp and letting the bracelet drop through the water to the bottom of the ocean. That's it. When I see him today, I'll tell him he has to buy me a new one. And that gets us to chapter 15 for tomorrow.